In this video, we're going to get the ball rolling by getting things started in talking about an overall overview of an introduction to research methods. For this module in the course, we've got some general learning outcomes. And I hope that as you go through the course, you feel less and less like Andy Dwyer here from Parks and Rec, where he says that he has no idea what he's doing, but he knows that he's doing it really, really well. And that sometimes happens when we are getting started and trying to figure out what this research stuff is all about. So I want to make sure, and as I said in the introduction video, demystify some of this process of what research is all about. How do we make sense of research that we encounter, and how do we think critically about our own topics of interest? And so in this brief video, I want to go through some of those principles that we read about in our two readings for this module. So just to get things started, as Dane noted, research is a process of asking and attempting to answer questions about the world. And that seems pretty simple, and in some ways it is, but it's actually complex as well. Research isn't just about asking questions. There's something systematic about it. It's not as simple as it sounds, but I don't want to make it sound like it's some super difficult thing to discern and dissect. So research is about asking questions. It's about having ways, having processes to attempt to answer those questions. And I think that word attempt is important, because there will be times when you read things in your graduate programs and then beyond where you'll come across something where somebody talks about a study that they've conducted and maybe things didn't go so well. Or they'll go through, explain all their procedures and show you all these great analytic procedures that they utilized for looking at their data. And at the end of the day, maybe there was nothing that was statistically significant for their study. That doesn't mean that it was a failed study, and it doesn't mean there's nothing that we can learn from it. It just means that things didn't go the way that the researcher anticipated or hoped. And so everything's about attempting to answer. In the context of qualitative research, we go into the field, and I say I identify largely as a qualitative researcher. We go into the field and we conduct our research, we gather our data, recognizing that through qualitative work we're probably not going to get at a conclusion of some sort. We may not get a clear answer to what we're asking. But that's part of understanding the process. And so as we go through this course, I think you'll find that each of these pieces that we discuss help us get us a sense and an understanding of what these processes are and how they're utilized in different ways and in different contexts. And some of those contexts connect these primary goals of research that Dane addressed. These 5 overarching goals for conducting research. And so Dane talks about them in some very, very specific ways. And one things I like about chapter 1 from Dane is this perspective of what are the questions that are asked within the context of each of these 5 primary goals. So Dane addresses abstract and concrete questions. And so for exploratory studies, the abstract question that we might ask is, does it exist? Is something actually a phenomenon? And a concrete example that we might use in the context of education and human services fields could be something along the lines of, does responsive intervention increase student achievement? Kind of a basic thing. Or where we utilize interventions in a variety of forms in education and human service fields. And so it's something that hopefully makes sense to us. We can get a feeling for, okay, I'm just trying to explore, does RTI do something? Is there something there? Then thinking about descriptive studies, really trying, and really I hope that these words for these approaches almost seem self-explanatory, particularly as you go through and you read that chapter from Dane. Again, I hope they're self-explanatory. So, a description. What are the characteristics of something? What are the elements that comprise something? So, an example might be, and I actually don't really like the example that Dane uses in terms of a concrete question, but I got where the author was going with the example that they utilized with witness testimony. But an example could be, what are the factors that make up a student's college choice process? That's descriptive. It's about identifying pieces of a process, pieces of a puzzle, if you will. Prediction is all about relationships. And so at one point in this course, we're going to talk about correlational research. And one aspect of correlational research can be predictive studies. And so this is an example. Is there a relationship between student attendance in class and final grade? So in other words, can we predict that a student who has better attendance earns a higher grade in a course? Explanatory studies are the way that Dane has encapsulated these is basically asking about cause and effect. And we have to be really careful, and this is a point that's going to come up a few different times in this course. We have to be careful when we talk about cause and effect. Because when you read studies, you will see things that are not explanatory research designs, or research designs connected to explanatory aspects of educational research, that make some statements and some assumptions about causation. In order to conduct a study, in order to determine causation, it really has to be an experimental study. And so, as Dane notes, there have to be at least two groups. You have a control group and experimental group. There's an intervention that's applied for one group and not the other, and you look to see where the differences between the groups. That's the only way that we can get at cause and effect. I've seen student work in the past, and some of the ways that we structured some assignments for ADM630 previously, where students would say, well, I'm going to conduct a survey in a proposed study and look to see if there's cause and effect between the way somebody answers one question versus how they answer another. That's just not possible. The only way to get at causal relationships is through experimental research design. And then finally, this fifth goal is in action research, and we are going to spend a little bit of time at the end of the semester talking about action research. And action research is all about, again, I hope it's self-explanatory, but it's action in research. It is somebody has an issue that in their particular context that they want an answer to, and they want to be able to use their research in that direct immediacy. I think there's a lot of action research that goes on that doesn't get labeled as action research. There's a lot of stuff that gets published that we read about in education that isn't labeled as action research. That doesn't mean it isn't action research, but that's actually why we've put action research toward the end of the class, because, and in fact, the way that we're addressing it in ADM 630 is looking at it from the perspective of program evaluation. And so actually Dr. Brogan is going to be providing some of that content for those modules where we get into program evaluation and the connection with action research. So with an understanding of these research methods and or kind of overarching aspects of research, we need to start thinking about how do we evaluate research? How do we discern what's good? How do we make sense of it all? And so there are different aspects of how we go about evaluating research. And I really like how Dane went through and talked through asking the questions of who, what, why, when, where, and how, because that's how we've really come to, and how we've been trained over through our own education over the years, from as early as elementary school, to ask questions and be inquisitive, is by asking these 6 questions. So the who, what, when, where, and why, and how are things that are important for us to keep in mind. As we read research, we need to think through these. So again, I really like the way that Dane went through this in chapter 1 of our textbook. So in terms of evaluating and being critical consumers of research, it is very important that we think through these questions. These are questions that I keep in mind as I read research, whether it's for my own use as a scholar, or as I'm selecting readings for a course, or as I'm working on my own writing and I'm including other people's work through my literature reviews and so on. I ask these questions of what I read. And it's important that we do this. So in terms of becoming critical consumers of research, is not just about being able to go through and pick out, well, here's the research method, and here's the type of research they conducted, and they made clear connections between their findings and their implications and their conclusions, and they followed APA format, and it was fairly easy to read, is well organized, and I didn't feel like an idiot after reading it. Because, friends, there are times I feel like an idiot after reading some stuff. And I don't know if it's because I'm an idiot or if because things just weren't done as well as they could have been in whatever that published work was. But that's not the point. That's not how we go about becoming a critical consumer of research. The process involves really taking the time and thinking through these questions. And so as we go through some of the assignments this semester, you're going to see this type of approach mirrored, particularly in the article critique assignments. You're not going to be asked specifically to address these 6 questions, but you'll see that in the way that that those assignments are structured, you're going to see this approach mirrored. So I want to shift gears away from Dane and think about some stuff from Cresswell for a few moments. And so in chapter 2 from Cresswell that I provided on Canvas, there are a few things that I want to touch on. One is the perspective worldviews. And yes, Cresswell is writing about qualitative research in the book that chapter 2 comes from. But I want to make sure to make a connection between his specific focus on qualitative research and big picture educational research and research in human services. So Cresswell talks about this idea of paradigms or worldviews. And the point that I want to make sure that I get across here, one is understanding that a worldview is simply a basic set of beliefs that guide action. And Cresswell was citing Guba for that quote. So there are our beliefs. And in qualitative work, qualitative researchers tend to be very direct about identifying how their own beliefs, how their own biases influence their research project and influence every aspect of the research design, the interpretation of the data, the implications, the conclusions. All of that is framed within the context of the researcher's worldview. And so in qualitative work, researchers readily acknowledge their subjectivity as part of the research project. And in quantitative work, by and large, efforts are made to minimize the influence of subjectivity, to try to move to a place that is closer to being purely objective. Again, I'm trained as a qualitative researcher. That's where the bulk of my experience lies with conducting research. I don't really subscribe too much to this idea that it's possible to move towards a place of objectivity in research, because we as humans are influencing the research design, even when it's a quantitative design. We're making choices about questions that are asked, participants, procedures for in terms of sampling and participant selection and assignment. We make decisions about the types of statistical tests that are run and how we make inferences from the statistical results. So we're still in that process and that research product on the quantitative side of things, but it's not acknowledged in quantitative work the way that it is in qualitative work. And so as you go through and you read things, not just for this class, but for your entire program at Murray State, I think it's important to be mindful of the potential for influence that a researcher's positionality, a researcher's bias has in that process and in the research product, which is the published work. Not to say that quantitative researchers are doing something wrong when they don't acknowledge that. It's just not part of the tradition of quantitative research. Cresswell talks about this perspective of post-positivism, where largely quantitative work, I shouldn't say largely, a lot of it, and a lot of what we continue to read in the social sciences that's framed in quantitative traditions draws on positivist notions that there is something that's reducible, that we can boil things down to their essential elements. And a post-positivist perspective is that there is nothing that's truly essential. That's where we get the connection to social constructivism, and we go on from there. So I just want to make those points and kind of get you thinking about, okay, things, whether an author acknowledges or not, there's a potential for their own positionality and subjectivities to play a role in the research process. And I don't want to spend a lot of time getting into these critical perspectives, but I do just want to make sure that I highlight that increasingly in qualitative work and somewhat in quantitative work, that's why I kind of backed up and said, okay, not all or not most quantitative work is bounded by a positivist worldview, that increasingly researchers in the social sciences relying on a variety of methodological approaches in their research are drawing on critical perspectives. I know folks who do tremendous quantitative work and draw on queer theory in that work. Likewise, I know folks who do some great quantitative work that draw on critical race theory. In fact, I can name folks who draw on all 5 of these critical perspectives using quantitative tools. I also know folks who use mixed methods and action research and qualitative work. And so these are not strictly qualitative aspects that we see. Although for years, if you saw somebody writing about disability theories and applying it to research, it was in a qualitative study. But that is shifted and that has started to change. And so let's then shift back to thinking about Dane's chapter 1 and how do we get started with a research project? Well, you're in this process right now. You're choosing a topic. And I'm really excited to read your submission for your topic selection, and I'll provide that feedback to you in a fairly quick manner so you can keep on chugging along through the course and keep making progress. So you go through the process of choosing a topic, and some of you have emailed, said, hey, does this topic look okay? And I will tell you, it is hard for me to say no at the beginning, because if you've selected a topic, I hope it's something that you're going to find interesting throughout the semester. But if something happens and you get the ball rolling and you've gotten a topic that you submit for the first assignment, and then you get in and you start looking through the literature, oh boy, I don't like this topic anymore. Don't worry. You don't have to, you can change topics. Just email me or call me and let's talk about that. One of the things that Dane talks about is operationalizing the topic by working through definitions. Well, for me, working through those definitions is something that you do as you engage with the literature. And so actually I can give an example. Let's say that you're working on a study about a particular subset of immigrants or students coming from another country to study in the United States. And they're coming from another country, they're citizens of that country, but you want to call them something dash Americans. That's fine if there's stuff in the published literature that suggests that is the nomenclature for this group of people. So I had a student when I was at another institution who wanted to work on this study, talking about students who were basically studying abroad from another country for an extended period, and wanted to refer to them as Vietnamese Americans. And generally speaking, the dash American is applied to people have an ethnic or cultural background from another place, but themselves are American citizens. In large part, were born in the United States. So one thing I had to keep pushing the student on was that definition is fine if you can support it from the literature. And so anytime that you're working on defining and operationalizing terms and concepts, that operationalization has to be based in what's in the literature. And so let's talk about how we go about that process a little bit. So the first step that I do for finding research is going to the library databases through the Murray State Library. And in week 4, we're going to have a video from Catherine Farmer, who is our resource librarian for education at Murray State. And she's going to provide a video going through exactly how we do this through the Murray State University Library's website. And I say week 4 because that's where it's the literature search portion of the course is. And we're also waiting for some IT folks to flip the virtual switch to turn on the new library website. So she's waiting for that to make her new video. But as we go through the databases, our first step is looking for peer-reviewed journal articles. So these are articles that are in academic journals where they've gone through a scrutinous process of review by other scholars. The next level would be something that's not peer-reviewed, but it's trusted. So this would be something like in education, Phi Kappa Delta, the Chronicle of Higher Education, Change Magazine. Those are just a few examples to think about. They're not newspapers, it's not Newsweek, it's not Time Magazine. It's things that are specific to a field of practice or a field of study that are highly regarded and highly trusted. If you have questions about what those could be, definitely ask me. But for your papers in this class, I ask you to get your minimum number of sources. Those you have to have peer reviewed. But then if you want to go beyond that and kind of build your paper and make it a little bit stronger, or maybe you've chased a topic down a rabbit hole, you found this one thing, it's not peer reviewed, but what is it any good? Ask me, and we'll talk about how you go through that process, and we'll go through the process together of figuring out, is it worthy of being included? And so then what do we do about books? Books are tricky because the reality is just about anybody can get a book published. Books don't have to go through a peer review process. I can submit a book proposal and we get a book contract and send in my draft. And if the editor that's been assigned to my book for that publisher likes it, then it gets published. So books can be tricky in terms of evaluating research, particularly for inclusion in our own work. when I'm looking at books for my own writing, I look at things that come from university presses. There tends to be a higher level of scrutiny within a university press. And then I look for the publishers who are kind of really well known within my field. So in educational research, I look at Sage publications. In higher education, I'll generally look at Josie Bass and Stylus Publishing. In some subsets in education, I might look at Prentice Hall. And so it just comes from knowing, but also, and this is a point that Dane makes, take a look at who folks that you're finding through those peer-reviewed articles, who are they citing? So if you see multiple folks citing the same book, well, if I were working on something where I wanted to make sure I was doing my due diligence and getting my hands on everything I can to a certain extent, I'm going to go look at that book that multiple people are citing. And then I almost didn't put this last point on here because I want to make sure that you understand that for this class and really for the bulk of your courses at Murray State, you'll be relying on peer-reviewed sources. But there's been a big rise in blogs by academic folks, and they are writing blog posts that are on level with peer-reviewed work in terms of the quality and the rigor that they are approaching that writing with. So there are folks who identify as public scholars, and they put themselves and put their work out there through blogs, through other websites. Maybe they write something for Medium, or the Atlantic. The Atlantic is a trusted printed source as well, but again, they're writing for those kind of sources in addition to their own blogs. Those can be good supplementary sources. Again, if you've kind of exhausted everything in the peer-reviewed realm, you've hit the trusted sources, and maybe you're writing about food insecurity among college students, and you find this article and it's really a blog post that Sarah Goldrick wrote for Medium, we'll grab that. I mean, because it's connected directly to that author's peer-reviewed and other published works that she's written. And so to recap, by large, the research that you're going to come across and what we're going to discuss this semester can be lumped into 5 overarching categories. And the process of evaluation research is all about asking questions. And understanding research involves thinking critically about the frameworks that guide that research and how those frameworks have an influence and are influenced by researchers' positionalities.